Okay, everybody, good morning. How's everybody doing? Good, good. I'm going to need everybody's help because we're going to talk about something today that if something like this is going to work and take off, then we're going to need the power of community in order for this to work. And I think Frame.io is a great place to do that, honestly, because of their blog and the type of community that they're actually involved in. And they're an integration company, and they're a collaboration company, and so that's kind of what this is. If this is a bad idea, you need to get me that feedback real quick so that I just move on to the next thing. So that's why I need everybody's help, because if this is a good idea, we've got to take it to the next place. And that's what we want to do. So we're going to talk about the possible need for a universal sensor. And this is specifically talking about large format, because if you think about it, in the world of 35, we've had that for a long time. We've had 35 for a long time, so we kind of have that thing going. But large format's new. And since large format's new, now is the time to make it work the way we want it before it goes off the tracks and starts going its own skews, right? So it's in its beginning phase right now, but we know it's not going to be a fad. Large format is absolutely going to be a trend. And so this is an opportunity to set things in motion that's going to work for a lot of people. I also want to thank Colin and Tommy, part of my partners that helped put this together, because this is sort of a brainchild of the innovation department, which is a department inside of Panavision and Lightiron that focuses on the horizon line, and that's sort of the vision that we have for things. So, you know, every camera has a slightly different shaped sensor. All of you realize that. Everybody watching, everybody that shot with cameras knows that we have a slightly different sized shape. Now, I'm not talking about resolution right now. Resolution might belong to whatever dogmatic God you pray to. That's totally fine. But so I want to make sure you understand, we're not talking about resolution. You could have one sensor the size of a dinner plate with 1 pixel. That's okay. That's totally fine if you wanted a really big white or black pixel. You could do that. But we're talking about the actual size of that dinner plate. Okay? Is this going to be large, small? Is it going to be tall? Is it going to be wide? Is it ideal for anamorphic? Is it ideal for spherical? Is it ideal for widescreen? Is it ideal for the web? Are we going to make things that are taller in the future instead of wider? Or is it going to be a version of both? These are the types of discussions that we must need to have right now. We didn't actually need these discussions in the world of 35 because there wasn't so many versions of things. We didn't have mobile devices. We didn't have all these different competitors for the size of screens, the shapes of screens, and things like that. So this is a picture of the world we have today. That's a big problem. And one of the coolest things about how big sensors work is people are starting to use more and more extraction techniques. So essentially an extraction technique, and Frame.io is one of these devices that can help with that, is when people use extractions, they end up shrinking down their intended framing to a smaller percentage so that they can make a note like, I want to reframe this and essentially tilt the camera down in post-production so that you can make that adjustment, right? So there's no blowing up of the picture, there's no scaling artifact or losing some sort of quality by doing a reframing. So extraction technique is very, very powerful for that. Most of you are probably comfortable with that. If you haven't, definitely get into it, because what's cool about that is you can make changes. I'm the product director of the DXL camera, and we love extraction techniques because when you have post-production as part of your workflow, you want to be aware of how you can adjust frames without having to compromise the quality. And what we kind of say is when you have a lot of resolution, you can finally afford to throw some of it away. You know, a lot of people are like, oh, it's all about how much resolution you have. Well, the truth is, the more resolution you have, the more you can remove. And that becomes a creative tool. That becomes something that you can modify or adjust later. So I like the idea of having extraction techniques. The problem with that is because every camera has a slightly different shaped sensor, and because we have to calculate camera extractions, it gets really confusing. Cinematographers, ACs, editors, dailies companies, everyone has to figure out what is the framing of the sensor, what is the framing chart we're extracting, what's the percentage of that, and because every sensor is a different shape and size, 10% doesn't mean the same thing on an Alexa as 10% means on a Venice or a DXL or a Monstro or a Ursa Mini, right? An extraction percentage is going to vary because they all start at a different starting point. The other problem with that is when you factor in your optics, the optical field of view is going to change, because every time you put a 50mm lens on a camera, what that 50mm lens can show is going to change based on the size and shape of that sensor. And this is really tricky for lens manufacturers, because the lens manufacturers have to sort of decide what our image circle has to cover in order to be used across all these different cameras. And some cameras, the medium to long lenses will cover the sensor, but the wides do not. And so now you have a problem with that. And we have people changing the resolution of the camera based on the focal length they're on. I know somebody's had to do that before, and that's not really useful. That's not efficient. So what we need to figure out next now is the idea of a universal sensor shape. And so that's what we're proposing today. It's just a proposal. We're not saying that this is the only way to go, but I think it's worth having a conversation and starting out this idea. So then your question here is this huge challenge: what is the right aspect ratio? And everybody's going to have a dogmatic religious God to pray to figure out what they believe about that. So here's what I'm proposing. I think the best way to do this is to examine all the aspect ratios in the market. These are extremely popular spherical aspect ratios. And so all of these you're familiar with. These all have a lot of heritage. Some of these are a little bit newer. Some of these are very, very legacy, but they have a lot of practical application. Then we've got the widescreen aspect ratios. And some of these are used with anamorphic lenses. And so this basically represents essentially all of the major aspect ratios that are used internationally. So when we looked at this, we didn't want to leave anybody out. We wanted to look at all the options that are out there. So the challenge: how do you pick the right aspect ratio? If you take all of these aspect ratios and you're trying to calculate one over the other, the problem is a cinematographer and an editor and a director, what they really need is one target exhibition or one distribution world. That's never going to happen. We're not going to be able to negotiate, no matter how hard we work, one single exhibition format. In a weird way, we were kind of lucky that 4x3 lasted as long as it did. I know what I just said. I heard what I said when I said it. But we had something that everyone is familiar with and everybody sort of agreed upon, for the most part, this shape. We just didn't like the shape we were limited to creatively. But we're not going to be able to negotiate that because of devices and because of changes in the actual exhibition formats that are going to be everywhere internationally, many of which that we're just starting to invent, right? So instead of making this about the exhibition formats, we need to make it about the acquisition format. Since we cannot control all the different aspect ratios that are going to be out in the world, we simply have to limit the amount of cropping as little as possible. In other words, if you're going to create a universal sensor size, it has to require the least amount of crop factor. Some sensors that are out there require 20 or 30% crop factors to be used in the platform they're going to distribute on. That's a bad shape, because you don't want to give up 30% of your resolution. One of these examples might be like IMAX. If you take a 1.9 or 1.8 sensor and you have to go to 1.43, you're going to cut off about 22% of the sensor just to make the picture. That's not ideal. But we have to factor that into our world, because that's what we're going to be facing. So here's what we came up with. If you add all these sensors together and you average them across every single sensor, every single aspect ratio that's out there, the average of all these sensors is 2.0. So 2.0 is essentially the average of every single aspect ratio that's on the market, which means the crop factor required to get from any sensor to any distribution aspect ratio would be the smallest possible. So you would have an unlikely situation where you'd have to crop 20 or 30% of the picture. So 2.1, which is actually something Storaro pushed a long time ago. So for those of you that followed the film aspect ratio wars a few decades back, Storaro said this is one of the greatest aspect ratio options. And when David Fincher started the series House of Cards. This was the very first time that 2.0 had found its way onto the internet in an actual released series like this. And that became something that people started to say, oh, that's kind of interesting, that's kind of working, that sort of fits this stuff. Some people do 2.2 to 1 on Netflix right now, which is an interesting place, and a lot of different techniques on a lot of the different companies. So 2 to 1 is that shape. Now, who is going to really benefit from this? I think the first people that we need to be concerned about is cinematographers. They need to have a way to calculate field of view, and it needs to be the same from camera to camera and lens to lens. So this is a really big problem, because when people are calculating field of view differentials, it's complicated. And every job, when people switch different cameras, different jobs, or they switch different resolutions in those jobs, and they end up having different crop factors. And we have to give them a little table, and they have to do some arithmetic. And when you're on the set, that's not the best place to be doing math. So we don't want people to have to do that. And that means your field of view is something that you can get used to. That also means directors can understand what a 50 millimeter is going to look like on every camera, as opposed to having to figure out what 50 is on one camera versus another. The next group that's going to really benefit from this are assistants, because they don't have to learn which lenses cover which focal lengths, right? Which sensors cover which focal lengths. And that's a big deal, because we have a number of situations at Panavision where some lenses simply don't cover the camera at every resolution. So this is an important group. It's going to help assistants a lot. Post and visual effects. When we do extractions, the extraction process can be universal, so that when we have framing charts and post and visual effects are performing extractions or reframing processes, they can work with a universal starting point. They don't have to know, okay, what camera was this? What's the source resolution? What was the source shape? Our shape is a square. We're going to a rectangle. These are all these problems that they can really take advantage of, not having to get bogged down. Lastly, lens manufacturers, because lens manufacturers, I don't know if there's any lens manufacturers here, but they need this a lot, because they're trying to develop so many different lenses in the large format world, which is very, very new and unstable, but they don't have a known target. So they have to sort of pick which sensors do they cover the most of. And when you're talking about lenses, if you're not familiar with how optics works, a millimeter difference on a lens and a sensor is like a mile when you're walking. It's a huge difference. So you might be like, well, these lenses are really close. What's a couple of millimeters? It's like, well, what's a couple of miles? Like, it's not something that you just fix real quick. So lens people need to have image circle analysis. Now, if you look at, some companies have done a really good job of showing off image circle comparisons. So they show the sensor, they show the lenses, and then you get this big white circle and this black background, and you can kind of see how much that lens covers. We don't want there to be a world where you have to figure out which of those are compatible with each other and which aren't. Wouldn't it be great if you're just like, whatever large format lens you purchased or rented worked on whichever large format camera you shot with? Like, it's not that crazy. When things were analog, we were used to this, because analog was so hard to create. Something like 35 millimeter film, everybody understood the geometry, and nobody was really making a 33 millimeter film competitor format, right? So lenses had a target. 35 millimeter was a target. We've lost that target, and it's going to get worse. It'll probably never get better, because there's just going to be a new device and a new aspect ratio and a new trend of how people watch things. So these are the groups of people that are going to really, really benefit from this. And this is probably the lazy person in me. So if I look at the lazy solution, 2 to 1 is easy math. It's really easy math, because if you're dealing with 2 to 1, then you have the ability to just divide everything in half. So it's like really, really simple. Now, this is where if people feel that there's a place where we should be discussing universal sensor, that's really good. So then the question becomes, well, what is the actual 2 to 1 size it should be? And so what we really think is a great way to look at this is, it's basically, if you use a 5 micron pixel and this sensor is 50 millimeters wide, how many millimeters tall will it be? 2 to 1. Someone yell it. 25. Thank you, Mark. Australia knows the math. So we're talking about 50 millimeters by 25 millimeters. This is so perfect because it's easy to do the arithmetic. It covers all of the full frame world, which is only 24 millimeter height. So you get a bonus in the height. And because it's not limited by the width, you get 50 millimeter width. So if you like VistaVision, you have the ability to have a wider picture and you have a taller picture all in one at this new potential golden easy math ratio of 2:1. Now this is where the math gets really cool and nerdy at the same time. If you end up with a 5 micron pixel, which is a great sort of size middle of the road pixel pitch, you end up getting 10K by 5K. So now the resolution math becomes really simple because you can simply divide by half again. So you either have 10K or 5K. If you're going to do that, then you end up with exactly a 50 megapixel picture. So the math becomes really easy again because we can calculate in 50 megapixel and that becomes a known target that's got whole numbers and it's really easy to factor that and it's base 10. So it's really easy to do extractions and crop factors and things like that if you're in a 50 megapixel world. And then here's something really cool for the anamorphic people. The people that really like the beauty of anamorphic, when you do this, a 6x5 anamorphic, which is a 2 times anamorphic lens, is literally 6K by 5K. It's so easy. You don't have to get out a calculator. You don't have to publish a really complex set of arithmetic to figure these crop factors. 6K by 5K. And then what's the resolution of that? 6 times 5. You can do all this in your head, so the megapixel counts can all be done without a calculator. And that's the type of stuff that I think matters on the set because people want to be able to make decisions quickly. You don't want to have to get out a protractor to explain to a director what we're doing in order to factor this stuff in. Now, many of you are pretty comfortable with doing this. Like, if you're saying, I'm actually totally fine with my 1.9 sensor or my 1.4:1 sensor, that's good. There's nothing wrong with the way we're doing it today. But I've been exposed to a whole community that has so many things to be concerned about, so many camera formats being mixed and matched on the same jobs, and so many lens manufacturers producing lenses based on different thoughts and different beliefs and different targets, that we have fragmentation in the market. And the same camera with one lens series might not produce the ideal picture that a different camera with a different lens series might produce. That's where that fragmentation, I think, is not necessarily helpful. And when you think about lens manufacturers as they try to anticipate what could be in the world in terms of their roadmaps, if they all knew the target would be something like 50 mil by 25 mil, they could start planning ahead with more time, and that helps them develop, and that helps people not have to pivot, and that allows the sensor manufacturers to kind of figure out if we're aligned with the lenses, now we have a known target, and nobody's really profiting from this independently because nobody actually makes this right now. So I'm not advocating for one company or another. This is just a discussion. This is how a discussion starts. We just have to start talking about it and debate it because certainly this isn't perfect and this isn't final, but we can start with this. And so I think it's really important just for the lazy people that want easy math. That might be a good enough reason for you. I mean, that's not a bad reason. But for the people that invest in equipment, for the owner-operators, they have to invest in lenses and cameras. Wouldn't it be great if your lenses, which are probably going to last a lot longer than your cameras, because lenses are the last analog portion of a camera, that's going to last longer. Wouldn't it be great if you could make sure that that lens you've invested in lasts on the next camera and the next camera, and we have a known target? Now, if someone wants to make a sensor that's 50 mil by 25 mil, and they want to do that at 3.5 microns, you could get another arithmetic output from that. Or if they want to make it at 8.25 microns, you could do that as well. So it's totally fine to examine what your flavor of pixel pitch is, how many pixels are going to be inside the sensor. That's totally okay. I still think that discussion falls a little bit more on the creative side. You have sort of a feeling about how pixels should behave. But other people, I think, we could argue that this aspect ratio is something that is more on the technical side because it allows us to get to any aspect ratio easier. That's where the creativity comes in place. You want to have the most flexibility to start with so that you can end with something that works really well. And so we have to start with a technical reason to work our way into the creative reason. I also think it's easier for people to get behind a universal sensor format instead of trying to convince people what resolution is good for them or bad for them. I think that's harder for people to get to, and that's a longer journey for all of us to take. But I think in the sensor format, it all works. So let's look at these together. These are all the sensors in the professional world today, and that is a 2:1 proposed a 10K 50 by 25, 2-to-1 sensor, and you can see it basically encapsulates a little bit of everything. And if you imagine these in your head and drew an average, that's the average. So it allows you to fit, and the people that want anamorphic, they're covered 6K by 5K. The people want VistaVision, they're covered 10K by 5K. And people that want extractions, you can do 10K, 9K, 8K, 7K, 6K. You can do whatever extraction, 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, and then that way you can factor in whatever resolution you want. You have enough resolution to throw a bunch of it away and use that resolution as a tool, not as some sort of prize that you're trying to win. That's not what resolution is for, some sort of contest that nobody's caring to make awards for. It's not about that. It is about using resolution as a tool, and this is how we do that. So that is what I wanted to share with you guys today, the idea of a universal sensor. If you think this is good, let's start discussing. If you think this is bad, let's start discussing, because skeptics are welcome. But if you like this idea, we need to go to the lens manufacturers, who are going to probably love this, and then we need to go to camera companies, and we need to pressure them to really consider this so they can start thinking about on their roadmap what the benefits are. This won't happen on its own. That's the one thing I'm sure of. This will only happen if a community is motivated together with the right interests collectively in mind to try to make something like this happen. And at Panavision, that's sort of what we're trying to do, is examine what the community can take advantage of. And I think at Frame.io, this is a great place to do that, because they like to discuss things. This is a place, and their blog you should really check out, because this is a place where Frame.io is actually having conversations. They make you think, and you may disagree with those conversations. That's the point, right? That's good, because that's how we can have discussions. We don't want to be in a room where we just talk about things that are easily proved and agreed upon ubiquitously, because we can't move the ball forward. So that's what we want to do. So that's what I wanted to have you guys participate today. I really appreciate everyone for coming out. So if you think this is good, let's keep having the conversation. We can make a hashtag called Universal Sensor, or hashtag No Universal Sensor, right? Like, maybe that's the right place. I don't know, but it's worth a discussion. So thank you guys so much for having me here. I really appreciate it. Thank you.